Thank you. All right. So welcome to day 3 of the No Bases conference. And I think today could arguably be the most important of the 3 days because of the work we'll be doing this afternoon, talking about steps forward, how are we going to go from here, where are we going to go from here, who are we going to work with. So I'm glad to see all of you back here on Sunday. Before we start, I would like to mention, first of all, I'd like to give another shout out to our incredible AV team, other voices, other choices. They've been doing a great job with the live stream and video recording. We're so happy they're able to be here. And I also wanted to mention, for those of you on the live stream, you obviously don't have a copy of our program, but the program contains bios of all of our speakers. But the people at home can look at the website, noforeignbases.org, and they can find all the bio information. But after the conference, we will be posting contact information for all of our speakers. We'll be posting copies of people's remarks. So we want everybody to have access to as much information as they can. So if you miss somebody's website, don't worry, we'll have that posted. Okay? noforeignbases.org. All right. Now I'd like to introduce our first speaker. I forgot to ask you, is it Anna or Anna?
It's Anya.
Anya Rebrii? Anya Rebrii. Anna is a student and activist engaged in Odessa's Solidarity Campaign, maintains the website ukraineaftermaiden.wordpress.com with updates on state oppression and right-wing violence in Ukraine. Participated as an interpreter and presenter at several conferences in the United States and Europe. Helped to organize events with activists from Odessa in the U.S. and a conference at the UN in Geneva on the war in Donbass titled What Future for Donbass, with a participation of international and Ukrainian academics and political analysts, as well as victims of conflict. So welcome, Anya.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel on Europe. Can you hear me okay? No? Should I just speak like this? Okay, no. I don't have much experience with the microphones. So I was already introduced, but what I can add is I'm very honored to have been invited to introduce other more distinguished panelists in this discussion on Europe, and we are still waiting for the third person, but he'll get here on time, we hope. So I believe I was chosen to moderate the panel not accidentally. As you've already found out, I'm originally from Ukraine, and I got involved in the struggle against the NATO and the U.S. Military involvement around the world when the conflict in Ukraine started. And so it's a personal issue for me. So Ukraine is just one of the recent target regions where U.S. and NATO continue to expand their influence in what some people call the new Cold War with Russia. And in my case, in my country, this expansion had disastrous effects for the population of Ukraine, including the civil war in the eastern part of the country, right-wing violence, and repression by the state of any kind of opposition. And more particularly, I've been involved with activists on the ground in Odessa. Odessa, the city where in 2014 right-wingers burned alive or killed with other means almost 50 people in the house of trade unions, people who were against the Maidan revolution and the what they saw as the coup d'etat by the United States and its allies. As have been already mentioned, I've been engaged as a member of Odessa Solidarity Campaign, and you can read about that more on in the program. And I believe it is very relevant to this panel on Europe. Before we start our discussion with the present panelists, I will read two statements from Europe. One is from Czech Republic, from Prague. It's the organization called Association Soldiers Against War. So the statement goes like this. Dear friends, colleagues, comrades, cordial greetings from Prague. We are the associated member of the World Peace Council, and so we welcome very much organizing the conference by the Coalition Against the U.S. Foreign Military Bases. This conference, which includes the efforts of various United States peace organizations, could unite and multiply efforts to reduce the international tension that is being created by building and deploying these bases practically all over the world. Your conference is of the great importance, and it also supports peace and anti-war organizations and initiatives, particularly on the European as well as on the Asian continents. We fully support your efforts to liquidate these bases that create a risk to the states on whose territories they are located, including United States troops. They also raise international tensions and threats of armed conflicts. The peoples of Europe know from their own experience the horrors and consequences of wars. Millions of dead in the ruins of cities. We do not want to experience this again. Your conference could become a milestone from which the process of the release of tensions could develop, as well as the gradual reduction of bases. Your success will be our success too. That is why, with all our heart, we wish successful discussion at the conference, mutual understanding and consensus on the fundamental issues of peace building and averting the danger of wars. We support calling global conference against U.S. military bases in foreign territories. We are ready to attend. Prague, January 7, 2018. On behalf of the Association Soldiers Against War, Chairman, retired Colonel Yuri Buryash. And the second solidarity statement is from the Belgrade Forum for a World of Equals. Dear friends, we congratulate you on holding National Conference Against U.S. Foreign Military Bases to be held in Baltimore, Maryland from 12-14 January 2018. The Belgrade Forum for a World of Equals fully supports your initiative for convening a global conference against U.S. foreign military bases. Rising tensions in the global relations and hotbeds of old and new crises call for unity and efforts of all peace forces for closing foreign military bases, particularly US and NATO foreign military bases around the globe. The peace forces are obligated to send clear message that US and NATO foreign military bases represent the tools of hegemonism, aggression, occupation, and that as such must be closed. Peace and inclusive development, elimination of hunger and misery require redistribution of spending for maintenance of military bases in favor of development needs, education, and health services. After the end of the Cold War, the whole humanity expected stability, peace, and justice in the world of equal states and nations. Such expectations, however, turned to be futile beliefs. In the last 2 decades, instead of closing US and NATO military bases in Europe, the continent has been interneted by the new US military bases. As a consequence, there are today more US military bases in Europe than at the peak of the Cold War. Peace and security have become more fragile and quality of life is jeopardized. This dangerous development was triggered in 1999 by NATO-US-led aggression against Serbia, former Yugoslavia. At the end of the aggression, US established military base in the occupied part of the Serbian territory Kosovo and Metohija called Bonstil, which is one of the most expensive and the largest military bases established after Vietnam War. It was not only an illegal but brutal act, disrespect of sovereignty of Serbia and basic principles of international law. Now, there is even a plan to expand the base Bonstil and to turn it into a permanent location of American troops and into a hub of US military presence in Southeast Europe. We strongly oppose such bellicose plans as being contrary to the interests of the peoples of the region and source of further rising tensions between East and West. We demand that the Bonstil military base be closed, as well as all other US military bases in Europe and in the world. Preparations for war are senseless waste of money, energy, and development opportunities. The Belgrade Forum, as an integral part of the world peace movement headed by the WPC, stands firmly by the initiative to close all military bases in the world and direct resources to development a better life of people. We express our solidarity with efforts of the coalition against US foreign military bases and wish the Baltimore Conference full success. Friendly yours, Zivadin Jovanovic, President of the Belgrade Forum for a World of Equals. So our first speaker will be John Lannon, I guess the second European on the panel on Europe. John Lannon is a founding member of the organization Shannonwatch, whose primary focus is ending US military use of the civilian airport Shannon in Ireland. He has been actively involved in human rights and anti-war campaigning over 2 decades, and has made numerous oral and written contributions to governmental and intergovernmental fora. He is a member of the National Executive of Peace and Neutrality Alliance, and is also actively involved in initiatives to support refugees and asylum seekers in Ireland. John works as a lecturer and researcher at the University of Limerick, and has published several academic works on human rights and development. Please welcome John Lannon.
Thank you, Anya. Can you hear me okay? Sound all right from this? Good. This seems like a little bit of deja vu, since I think on Friday evening, for any viewer here, you heard the same introduction to me. I haven't changed since then. Yeah, as the statement that Anya read said, there are more US military bases in Europe now than in Cold War times. I mean, the US armies all over Europe, Germany, Italy, UK is where most of the bases are, but then Poland, Netherlands, Belgium, Greece, Portugal, Spain, I think there's about 3,000 troops stationed there. Elsa spoke about Ramstein and Singanella in particular on Friday evening. Most of the material around the US's presence in Europe doesn't even mention Ireland or Shannon, where 3 million troops and their weapons have passed through over the last 16 years or thereabouts. I'm actually going to start with Ireland, since in some respects we're kind of an interesting case on the periphery of Europe. Do any of you know who these 2 guys are? Eamon de Valera, good stuff, yeah. Eamon de Valera was the leader who drafted the Irish Constitution, and he was a firm supporter of Irish neutrality. He's the one on the left there. The Irish Constitution doesn't actually enshrine neutrality in it. The historical reason was that at the time of its adoption, basically there was overwhelming political support for neutrality. The other guy then is our current Prime Minister, Leah Varadkar, and he said back in, I think it was October, that it was Eamon de Valera's finest hour was keeping Ireland neutral during the Second World War, which is great, but in practice he and all of the parties who have led Ireland over the last 40 years or thereabouts have been systematically dismantling Irish neutrality. You know, we've been members of NATO's Platform for Peace. We've been involved in the militarisation of the EU through institutions like the European Defence Fund. We've allowed those 3 million troops and their weapons through Shannon Airport. So that neutrality has been intentionally eroded. So we're very much part of the EU. I suppose in some respects, you know, we're a former colony of the UK. We're an enthusiastic supporter of the EU, which was the European Economic Community. We're very dependent on the US for foreign direct investment in Ireland. But let me talk about Europe just for a while now. And the EU really was as much about the decline of European empires as it was about building an economic community. And it always had NATO support, and it always supported NATO. And since the end of the Cold War, the European political elite have set about, or have seen themselves as a global power, or have aspirations to be a global power. They have economic interests all over the world, of course, and these form the basis for a sort of a military-supported extension of its power and of its influence. And And we now have a really powerful network of politicians and industrialists around Europe, and they're lobbying for more investment in armaments development and the militarization of the EU. And this is the bit that I want to have, the conference think about as well. This sort of axis that we have, between the US, NATO, and the EU, and this increasing push towards militarization across that alliance. Last September, for example, Macron, the French president, outlined his grand vision for Europe, or for the future Europe, and he said, at the beginning of the next decade, Europe must have a joint intervention force, a common defence budget, and a joint doctrine for action. That's what Macron wants. So if we go back a couple of years before that, one of the most significant steps towards a militarized Europe was something called the Lisbon Treaty. And that came into effect 2009. It effectively gave the European Union a federal constitution. So we're now all sort of, subservient to that constitution. All of the member states are required to increase their military spending and to make facilities available for EU military activity. It extended on the grounds, this Lisbon Treaty did, the extent to which the EU can engage in military activities or interventions beyond its borders. It strengthened links between the EU and NATO. And in fact, it allowed a small group of states to form a military alliance within the EU and to develop the cooperation with NATO. Incorporation of national defence forces into EU military spending and structures, military operations really being focused around political economic ends of the European Union powers. And the EU, one of the interesting things was the EU defence policy that was outlined in the Lisbon Treaty was explicitly intended to be compatible with NATO, including the first strike nuclear policy. That's the intent of the Lisbon Treaty. Incidentally, Ireland was the only country that got a vote on whether or not we would join the Lisbon Treaty. We voted against it. What happened? They reran the vote. And so thank you for the applause for the first attempt. But the second one, unfortunately, we were overrun by the mainstream media's push for us to be part of Europe, to be good European citizens, and they rammed through Lisbon in Ireland, and we signed up to it, unfortunately. So more and more of the military budgets now have been established at European level. This, of course, is at the expense of social policies, exactly as it is here in the US. We've got it's a mirror image very much, or becoming a mirror image of what's happening here in the US. And we get sold this by the European elite through really benign glib catchphrases. They sound wonderful. Efficiency enhancement, economies of scale. We get these. And the latest one now is, in fact, it goes back to Lisbon, is structured cooperation. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? Yeah, it does. So we actually signed up to a defence pact now called Permanent Structured Cooperation, or PESCO. There are 25, it sounds wonderful as well, PESCO is so benign, but it's basically 25 EU countries have signed up to this. It's committed them to close cooperation in the development and purchase of weapons, making available troops and equipment for joint military interventions. Actually, the German Defence Minister, Ursula von der Leyen, she said the signing of PESCO was a great day for Europe. The parties, she said, were taking a further step towards an army for Europe. And this is what, at least she was honest about it. Our politicians in Ireland and other parts of Europe are not honest about it, but that is the intent. It's a European army. There are actually only 3 countries in Europe that have opted out of PESCO. Denmark has always had a special opt-out clause from going back to Lisbon, even though they are a member of NATO. The UK, of course, which is about to withdraw from the European Union, and Malta is the other one, which has neutrality officially enshrined in its constitution. So a lot of these discussions are shaped around, these existential threats to European way of life. You hear them all here as well. Islamic terrorism, there's Trump isolationism, there's Putin's aggressive anti-EU agenda. We hear all of these. We get all of these all of the time. Let me go back here, see what I've got here. Yeah, actually, this is a map of, these are the countries in Europe that have signed up to PESCO. These are the ones, the black ones that are the NATO members. So, a few differences, but essentially most of the countries are members of both. There was a good article that I read a little while back, Jürgen Wagner, he said about, does the EU as a driving force of armaments? And he actually expressed a view that I would concur with, which was that the EU label sort of for militarization, or the EU label, I'd say in general, it appears to mobilize Europeans more in terms of spending or boosting their military capabilities than NATO, the NATO label does. The EU label seems to be more palatable. During the Cold War, European states felt they had little option, I guess, as well, but to counter the threats from the Soviet Union. They needed the US. The US became the uncontested hegemonical power in the Western Alliance, but and the military questions were for a long time just a matter for NATO, and hence mainly the US. But around the start of the 1990s, there was a shift, and German military policy became more aggressive around then. And the opportunity for Europe to become a global power in its own rights began to emerge then. And the Western Alliance, though, has held firm, that US, NATO, EU alliance. Formal declarations are signed back in 2002, I think it was. George W. Bush came over. George W. Bush told us that the US would welcome a capable European force properly integrated with NATO that provides new options for handling crises where NATO chooses not to lead. So that's where we are in the European Union now. And of course, we've had the expansion of the European Union east towards Russia. We have something called the European Neighbourhood Policy, which works with countries to the south and to the east. The objective, it says, is to foster stabilisation, security and prosperity in line with the global strategy for the European Union's foreign and security policy. And I'm going to show you a diagram. We'll go back to this one because I was particularly struck by this. It was the idea of a grand area for Europe that was presented by a guy called James Rogers. And it's like a mapping of a European empire, essentially. And it covers large parts of Africa. It covers the oil-rich Caspian region, it covers the Middle East, and it also stretches into East Asia. And somebody mentioned yesterday about the importance of the maritime routes, and this is something that Europe as well, of course, has its eye on. And to date, though, the European Union's missions, I suppose, have been characterized by what analysts would call a kind of a reactive nature. In other words, EU missions like Kosovo, Mali, Somalia, they've been in response to events that were outside of the European Union's control in many respects. But the EU Commission is now clearly of the view that a more coordinated EU defence policy is necessary and result in better ability to exert influence in this global arena. So the EU is expanding its ambitions territorially, but as we've heard that, from speakers yesterday, the US dominance or its global hegemony or power and influence is decreasing, and Europe is concerned about this as well. It's worried that this is true. So we now hear voices in Europe, and we hear, and I guess it's the same here, about this new sort of global confrontation that we've got between democracies. In other words, the US and Europe versus the autocracies, the Chinas, Russia and Iran. And this discourse has returned. It's like history has returned. We've liberalism and democracy versus autocracy all over again. And the EU and NATO now, they're meeting regularly. EU is funding combat-ready troops. And we've got those in place now through what we call EU battle groups. And there's cooperation there between NATO and the EU, and it's designed to increase the capabilities for military interventions. And just last December, the EU's head of Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, I think she's called Federica Mogherini, she met with her NATO counterpart, Stoltenberg, and talked about strengthening that partnership. So they got together and pushing forward this strengthening of an alliance. So Europe today, basically, we've got Eurozone, our common currency, permanent crisis. We have Brexit, and this is an interesting one now. So Britain leaving the European Union in March 2019, because this is seen by many as an opportunity, actually, for further EU militarization. The British were the ones that always held back the drive towards European militarization. So when they get out, it's full steam ahead for the securocrats in Europe. And then with far-right parties on the rise around a lot of European countries. And there's a reactionary response to what's referred to as our migration crisis. In other words, large numbers of people fleeing from the wars that we've helped to create in the first place. So, you know, and of course, the dots are not joined in Europe. We do not talk about us being the root cause in our alliances with the US for the migrations of so many people from the Middle East and Africa. So in terms of the where Europe is at now, Europe is kind of fearful and uncertain in many ways now. And this new European military-industrial complex, you know, it's become sort of a more powerful, and that of course means there's a growing emphasis on essentially on violence, isn't it? On militarization in the European Union, and that's going to increase rather than reduce conflict, and cycles continue. Okay, so. Right, since I think my time is nearly up, back to this guy, Leo Varadkar. As I said, he appears to have changed his mind, or the Irish political elite's mind about neutrality. Ireland must stay neutral, he said, which is great. He doesn't expect Ireland to ever join NATO, which is also great. It's probably the most significant statement we've had from an Irish leader on this matter for decades. But he's not going to stop the US, NATO, EU militarization and expansionism. He's not going to do that. His statements are encouraging, but we need to push to ensure that he lives up to them. You know, and in many respects, you know, this is opportunity we see for us in Ireland if he can be the one to you know, if we can force him to be the one to break the links with empire and this growing sort of Western alliance of the US and emerging EU empire building. Let me, if I have a minute or two, just to finish. If I do, just I think I have some slides here since we're back at Ireland on, yeah, where we are at in Ireland right now. So. I have two photographs here. The top one is the European Rapid Reaction Forces, which are part of the collaborations with NATO that Ireland has provided troops for. And I have a quote there from one of our ministers for foreign affairs. Ireland's traditional policy of military neutrality is unaffected by our participation. How? I'm just baffled by that. Maybe somebody can explain it to me. The bottom picture is one that I'm sure some of you may have seen before. It's in our booklet on Shannon. It's some very tired-looking soldiers in the duty-free lounge at Shannon Airport. And we have another, well, basically this is an official line from every foreign affairs minister since 2003. US military aircraft being refueled at Shannon are, quote, unarmed, carrying no arms, ammunition or explosives, not engaged in intelligence gathering, and not part of any military operations or exercises.
Just torture.
Just torture, perhaps. Yeah. We're not sure what they're doing. So, not surprisingly, we've asked, so what are they doing if they're not doing any of that stuff? Christmas gifts. Actually, what's quite interesting about this is that we've also had the CIA rendition flights coming through Shannon Airport, and we repeatedly asked for inspections of those planes, as we do of the military planes, and they did actually give us the results of one inspection of one plane at one time. because it happened to be on quite a benign mission, and it was actually carrying toothpastes and some other goods like that. They did not tell us what was on all of the other flights that were coming through. This is the airport. It's a very quiet little airport. It's really conveniently located on the west coast of Ireland, so it's easy for for the U.S. Army to use this. Here's I think it's from Flight Radar. You can see there's very little traffic, very little flight traffic through our airspaces. These are the sort of planes that we monitor and we record there every day of the week, essentially. These Omni Air International and Atlas Air troop carriers arrive every day. Got people, in full military camo walking into the duty-free lounges all of the time. Here's just an indication of the rendition networks that we've been part of. And as you can see, Shannon Airport is one of the key hubs that was used by the CIA and their contracted planes. We do regularly take part in, or do engage in non-violent direct actions. Here are two wonderful people, Dave Donlan and Colin Roddy, who went airside to attempt to inspect one of the planes that our authorities wouldn't inspect. The other photograph on the left are two members of Parliament, Mick Wallace and Claire Daly, who have been trenchant supporters of our cause to get the US military out of Shannon. Some photographs of our peace vigils as well. In fact, there was one happening that just finished a half an hour ago at Shannon, where we had a group of people calling for the US military out of Shannon. So I'll leave it at that.
Is it working? Okay. Thank you, John, for your analysis and updates on the so-called structured cooperation between NATO and EU. The next speaker is Phil Wilayto, who is a founding member of the Defenders for Freedom, Justice and Equality, an organization in Richmond, Virginia, an all-volunteer community organization. He is also a coordinator of Odessa Solidarity Campaign, and editor of the quarterly newspaper, The Virginia Defender. Among other things that are mentioned in his bio in the program, he organized in 2007 a People's Peace Delegation to Iran, which became the basis for his book, In Defense of Iran, Notes from a U.S. Peace Delegation's Journey Through the Islamic Republic. Phil's writings appeared in different journals and online outlets, including Z Magazine, Guardian, Iranian Fars News Agency, Alternet, Truth Out, and others. Phil currently is a member of the UNAC Coordination Committee, as well as the Board of Directors of the Campaign to End Sanctions and Military Intervention in Iran. Please welcome Phil Wilayto.
Well, my parents would be proud of me today. My father, whose people were from Poland, and my mother, whose people were from Ireland.
That's good, right there. Yeah.
See, I can't hear it. I can't hear myself.
That's all right.
I'm more confident like this. Okay. So anyway, I'm up here with two Irishmen and a Ukrainian, so I feel very honored. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, this is good. Right where you are now, Phil, it's good. It's good. We know that. We know it's good.
This is called participatory democracy. I appreciate it. Don't breathe. I'm going to talk a bit about NATO and its expansion towards Russia, what the U.S. is doing in Ukraine, and what I think are the plans for Russia. And my good friend Ray McGovern tells me I shouldn't read the report because that's boring and I should make it really personal. And I'm not going to do that because there's a lot of facts and figures. Ray can do this. He has it all in his head. But I did a lot of research on this and I don't want to screw it up. When the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was founded on April 4th, 1949, it had 12 members, the U.S. and Canada and 10 Western countries. By then, the wartime cooperation with the Soviet Union was long over, and NATO was essentially an anti-Soviet political and military alliance. Come on, back up there. 6 years later, as a counterbalance, the Soviet Union formed the 9-member Warsaw Pact, formerly the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance. That alliance was dissolved in 1991, 10 months before the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union. By then, the U.S. had assured the Soviets that NATO would not be expanding eastward. U.S. officials now deny that, but this is from the Los Angeles Times of May 30th, 2016. Quote, in early February 1990, U.S. leaders made the Soviets an offer. According to transcripts of meetings in Moscow on February 9th, then Secretary of State James Baker suggested that in exchange for cooperation on Germany, the U.S. could make, quote, ironclad guarantees, unquote, that NATO would not expand, quote, 1 inch eastward, unquote. Less than a week later, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev agreed to begin reunification talks. No formal deal was struck, but from all the evidence, the quid pro quo was clear. Gorbachev acceded to Germany's Western alignment, and the U.S. would limit NATO expansion. Far from limiting NATO's expansion, the U.S. vigorously promoted it. In 1999, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland were admitted into NATO. In 2004, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia all became NATO members, followed in 2009 by Albania and Croatia and Montenegro this past June 5th. So today, NATO has expanded to 29 member countries, with 13, nearly half, either former members of the Soviet bloc or part of the former socialist state of Yugoslavia. All new members admitted into NATO since the collapse of the Soviet Union are in Central or Eastern Europe. From a North American and Western European alliance, it has become a North American and all-European force that has moved steadily eastward right up to Russia's borders. And John, thanks for leaving the slide up, because this really shows that the countries in dark are members of NATO, the countries with the slants, Ukraine and Georgia, which are on their way to becoming members of NATO. In 1992, 6 post-Soviet states, Russia and the much smaller countries of Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, signed the Collective Security Treaty, or Tashkent Treaty. But of those, only Russia is a major military power. In NATO, the United States, United Kingdom, and France together possess a total of 7,315 nuclear weapons. Russia is believed to have a total of about 7,000. But in terms of overall military power, Russia's military budget in 2016 was just over 8% of the combined total of all NATO countries, and just over 11% of the United States alone. This is important because one of NATO's founding principles is that an attack on any one member country is to be considered an attack on all NATO countries. Today, Russia is faced with a massive military and political alliance that includes Estonia and Latvia, 2 of the 5 countries on Russia's western and southern borders. Georgia, which borders Russia's southern flank, is not yet a NATO member, but has been accepted for membership pending meeting certain internal reform requirements, privatization. Meanwhile, according to the NATO website, quote, Georgia has provided valued support for NATO-led operations in Kosovo and Afghanistan. Belarus and Russia remain allies, and in September 2016 carried out joint military exercises in Belarus well within its borders with Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Ukraine. But this is how the exercises were reported by National Public Radio. In one of the biggest shows of military might since the end of the Cold War, Russia and Belarus are conducting joint maneuvers on NATO's doorstep.
Whoa.
Where the exercises are prompting jitters in some former Soviet satellites. Much less well reported is the rapidly increasing military cooperation between the U.S. and Ukraine, including in the Black Sea, which borders both Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine is not yet a member of NATO or the European Union, but its Western-oriented president, who was installed in a bloody U.S.-backed coup in 2014, would like it to be, and has recently announced that a referendum on the question will be held soon. Meantime, the country, which shares a more than 12,000-mile land border with Russia, is acting as a NATO member in all but name. Every year, U.S. soldiers are in Ukraine taking part in the annual multinational military exercise called Exercise Rapid Trident. This past year, U.S. participation with some 400 soldiers was the largest ever. Every year, the U.S. Navy leads an international flotilla of warships in and around Ukraine's Black Sea coastline as part of an exercise nicknamed Sea Breeze. Last year's operation was also the largest ever, including approximately 800 soldiers from various U.S. military branches. And on an ongoing rotating basis, members of the National Guard from a number of U.S. states are in Ukraine training Ukrainian soldiers in combat roles, headed for Donbass. I want to read you a notice that was posted yesterday on the official website of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. Quote, Ukrainian naval aviation and the guided missile destroyer USS Carney underwent joint training in the Black Sea. The aim of these maneuvers was to work out cooperation under NATO standards and increase the interoperability. Following the scenario, 2 Ukrainian helicopters landed on the deck of the USS destroyer, USS Carney, docked in Odessa port, January 8th to 11th. Think about that. It'd be like Russia and Mexico carrying out joint military exercises in the Gulf of Mexico so they could cooperate in time of war. Further, the U.S. National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2018 authorizes $500 million to provide military aid to Ukraine, including for the first time what is called defensive lethal assistance. This comes on top of what the Reuters news agency reports has been $750 million in non-lethal aid, such as uniforms and radars, since 2015. These exercises, training missions, and military are always described as, quote, defensive in nature, meant to help Ukraine protect itself against alleged Russian aggression. But it's not Russia that's expanding its military influence right up to the borders of the United States. It's not Russia that has built a military alliance that now includes 29 countries moving ever closer to its declared adversary. Members of the U.S. Congress and the media accuse Russia of meddling in the last U.S. election, but the U.S. did more than meddle in Ukrainian politics. It overthrew the country's president with the help of neo-Nazi organizations that have unleashed a reign of terror in the east from Odessa to Donbass. I saw members of these fascist organizations myself on May 2nd, 2016, when I traveled to Odessa with anti-war activist Bruce Gagnon, who's here today, and Regis Tremblay. We were there as international observers at the second anniversary memorial for the victims of a fascist mob at the city's House of Trade Unions. That was less than 3 months after the coup, and neo-Nazi organizations were violently suppressing anti-coup forces. On May 2nd, the fascists drove a much smaller group of opponents into the trade union building and set it on fire. At least 46 people died from the flames, smoke inhalation, gunshot wounds or beatings, and to this day there has never been an international investigation of this atrocity because the Ukrainian government won't allow it. As preparations were being made for the 2016 memorial, organizations like the Azov Battalion, Right Sector, and the Brotherhood were threatening to attack those attending the event with machine guns. The members of the Azov Battalion had shoulder patches featuring the yellow lightning strike of a former Nazi SSS unit. The battalion has since been incorporated into Ukrainian military, while Right Sector, at the invitation of the Ukrainian government, has participated as an independent militia in the fighting in Donbass. They were held back that day because 3,000 Odessans of all ages came out to Kulikovo Pole Square and held their memorial despite the death threats. And they stayed there for 14 hours on that Memorial Day. When we returned to the U.S., we founded the Odessa Solidarity Campaign, which includes Ray, Bruce, Anna Rebrii, and myself. And you can find us on Facebook at Odessa Solidarity Campaign or at odessasolidarity.campaign.org. What we are told on this side of the pond is that the problem in Ukraine is Russian aggression. What we don't hear is that the present crisis is the direct result of the U.S.-promoted right-wing coup of 2014, or that the coup was just part of the overall strategy of U.S. imperialism to reduce Ukraine to a vassal state and staging area for its own aggression against Russia, which is rapidly increasing. I don't believe the real danger here is a war between the U.S., NATO, and Russia. I think the expansion of NATO and increasing U.S. control over Ukraine is meant to both intimidate Russia and force it to increase its military spending at the expense of domestic needs, which inevitably leads to internal tensions. For example, Russia's 2016 military outlay of $69.2 billion was an increase of 5.9% over the year before. Meanwhile, in 2016, the U.S. spent about $597 billion, almost as much as the next 14 countries combined. In 2015, the U.S. accounted for 37% of the world's total military spending. This was the strategy the U.S. under President Ronald Reagan followed with great success against the former Soviet Union. Today, the strategy has been refined. Today, the U.S. and an array of allied non-governmental organizations or NGOs seek out, train, and generously finance internal dissidents who then build mass movements by raising charges of corruption and undemocratic rule. The original charges may be correct, but the political movements they generate quickly become campaigns to replace the government with more Western-oriented ones that promote neoliberal policies of privatization, deregulation, social austerity, and so-called free trade. Progressives who can recognize this strategy in Venezuela and Cuba sometimes become confused when the same strategy is applied to Ukraine, Russia, or Iran. Sisters and brothers, we have our work cut out for us. We need to take this information to the working people of the United States and all the countries of the world. We need to show how imperialist aggression abroad is intimately connected with attacks on working people and communities of color here at home. Hopefully, whatever initiatives come out of this conference will reflect those concerns. I hope I finished up in less than 15 minutes because I would like to introduce a special guest at the conference. Alexander Prigarin, a native and resident of Odessa, Ukraine, who has traveled here on his own expense to be at this conference today. Professor Prigarin holds a PhD in historical sciences and teaches at the Department of Archaeology and Ethnology in Ukraine at Odessa National University, one of Ukraine's leading universities. He is a member of the editorial boards of several academic periodicals and the author of more than 250 scientific publications. He's also an activist who spoke at UNAC Stop the Wars at a Home and Abroad conference in Richmond this past April. Under very difficult conditions, he is trying to sound the alarm about the increasing U.S. military involvement in Ukraine, and I'd like to invite him up to give us the view from Odessa on NATO expansion and resistance to it.
Дорогие друзья, для меня большая честь участвовать в вашем мероприятии.
Dear friends, I'm very honored to participate at your event.
По одной простой причине, что это означает, что Америка это не только война и НАТО, но и мир.
Because this means that the United States is not only NATO and war, but it also means peace.
Специальные слова благодарности и пожелания дальнейшего сотрудничества хочется выразить компании Одесской солидарности.
My special gratitude and hopes for further coordination to Odessa Solidarity Campaign.
Потому что в условиях тяжелой трагедии мы, к сожалению, не можем о ней говорить публично в Украине.
Because in the conditions of this huge tragedy in Odessa, we are not able to speak about it publicly in Ukraine.
Потеряв практически всякую надежду на судебное решение этой ситуации,
Having lost every hope for a legal resolution of the situation,
нам остается только верить на справедливость и на общественное возмездие.
we only hope for justice and public revenge.
Фил прекрасно, точно обозначил основные риски и реалии сегодняшней ситуации в Украине.
Phil highlighted in exact manner all the risks and realities in the current situation in Ukraine.
Я позволю себе обозначить лишь некоторые аспекты
And
ситуации.
I will only indicate some of other aspects of the situation.
Весь драматизм сложившейся ситуации связан с тем, что противостояние России и НАТО послужило главной причиной гражданской войны в Украине.
So the dramatic nature of the situation consists in the fact that the opposition of Russia to the NATO has served as a reason for the civil war in Ukraine.
Политическая элита Украины везде видит путинский след.
The political elite of Ukraine is seen in everything trace of Russian influence.
Не подумайте, что это шутка, но если бы здесь были представители правительства Украины, то в демонстрации, которая состоялась позавчера, очевидно, Путин присутствовал в виде рекламы яиц Фаберже на фоне демонстрации.
I don't think that it's a joke, but if any representatives of the Ukrainian government were present at the demonstration on Friday, they would declare that Putin's influence was present in the symbolic advertisement of Fabergé exhibition at the museum across the street.
При этом, при всем абсолютно четко замалчивается активное присутствие НАТО в событиях.
And what is being silenced is the involvement of NATO in all the events in Ukraine.
Начиная от присутствия офицеров, экспертов, заканчивая теми тренировочными действиями, которые происходят на Донбассе.
And starting with the presence of experts and military officials and ending with the the military events in Donbass.
Из последних фактов демонстрации это заход в Одесский порт эсминца.
And so the very recent sign of NATO involvement is, of course, the presence of the Navy in the port of Odessa.
И создание на территории Харьковской области тренировочного лагеря, где будут обучаться офицеры Украины под руководством натовских специалистов.
And including the creation in the Kharkov region, another city in Ukraine, of a training camp where Ukrainian officers, soldiers will be trained under the NATO leadership.
Цинизм ситуации заключается в том, что правящая элита Украины всячески ссылается на рост симпатии к НАТО среди населения страны.
And the ruling elite of Ukraine keeps referencing the support among the population of Ukraine of joining and cooperating with NATO.
В начале 2000-х годов лишь 3% выступало за вступление Украины в НАТО.
In the beginning of 2000s, only 3% of the population was in support of the joining NATO by Ukraine. Only 3%.
Были потрачены десятки миллионов долларов для пропаганды этой идеи.
Tens of millions of dollars have been spent to propagate this idea.
И исследования 2013 года дают не выше 15%.
And the studies from 2012 still show not more than 15% of support.
Видимо, тогда начали действовать более активно.
It looks like at that point they started acting in a more engaged fashion.
Исследования декабря 2017 года дают уже 38%.
Because the studies from December of 2017 already show around 36%.
Несмотря на то, что это означает, что 2/3 явно против,
Even though this means that 2/3 are apparently against the idea.
есть элемент манипуляции. То есть эти исследования проводятся в условиях тотального запрета на другую точку зрения. То есть все сторонники того, что НАТО не место в Украине, просто блокируются, иногда даже арестовываются, то есть репрессируются.
And these statistics, of course, include an element of manipulation. There has been a total repression of any opposition and opponents of the current government, current policies. They have been consistently blocked and even arrested.
Несмотря на это, почти 7% указали на прямое противостояние НАТО и вступление Украины вообще в российский военный блок.
And despite of all of this, around 7% they are expressed their opposition to joining NATO and to having any relationship with NATO.
А если вернуться к цифрам, то оказывается парадоксально, что количество тех, кто хочет вступления Украины в НАТО, не изменилось.
But if we return to numbers, there is still a paradox that, in fact, the number of those who support the idea of joining NATO hasn't changed, despite the increasing numbers in the statistics.
Дело в том, что Украина на этот момент потеряла почти 6 миллионов регионов, которые непосредственно были против НАТО.
And the reason is because at the time of the studies, Ukraine has lost a region of 6 million people who oppose the idea of joining NATO, meaning the eastern part of Ukraine.
При этом, при всем, идет активная депопуляция, и около 4,5 миллионов – это те, кто уехали за границу работать.
And at the same time, there has been an increase in the population of the country because around 4.5 million of people have left the country to work in Europe.
Это явный пример манипуляции и циничного отношения к собственным гражданам.
And this is a very representative example of manipulation and cynical treatment of the population by the government.
И закончу с той мысли, с которой я, наверное, начал. Я с завистью смотрю на возможность публичного протеста.
And I will end with a thought with which I actually began. I envy the possibility of a public protest, public expression of opposition that he's witnessing here.
Несмотря на то, что украинская элита декларирует демократические ценности, подобной акции в Украине я сейчас представить себе не могу.
Even though the Ukrainian elites have been declaring their support for democratic values, I cannot imagine an opportunity for such an event happening in Ukraine at the moment.
Спасибо. Всем мира и дружбы.
Thank you. I wish you all peace and friendship.
A tough crowd.
Well, I'm glad to see such an enthusiasm in the crowd, and hopefully the next conference will be attended by more young people who are naturally more enthusiastic, right? And I wanted to... Well, I also wanted to thank Phil for making connections between our struggle against NATO and the struggle of the working class and the communities of color. And so hopefully, beside more young people, we will also see more people of color in our next events. And so we have our last speaker, last but not the least, of course, and Ray McGovern. He probably doesn't need an introduction, but I will follow the duties of a moderator, and I'll make it short to leave him more time to speak. So he was a CIA analyst from 1963 to 1990, and in the 1980s, he chaired national intelligence estimates and prepared daily president's briefs. He was publicly critical of President George W. Bush's use of intelligence in the lead up to the war in Iraq. With other former CIA employees, he founded the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, the organization dedicated to analyzing and criticizing the use of intelligence, specifically relating to the war in Iraq. Upon his retirement, he was granted the Intelligence Commendation Medal, which he returned in 2006 in a protest of CIA's involvement in torture. So, Ray McGovern, please.
Thank you very much. Is this okay right here? Yeah, well, you know, they say if you're not there, you can't help. And Phil and Bruce being over there, right on the square there in Kiev and also in Odessa, of course, that was a big help. We in Veterans for Peace were in Palestine in February and March, and we stayed with the Tamimi family for 2 nights. I hope that you know of Ahed Tamimi, who was 16 years old. I had some photos with me in my all-purpose backpack, and I gave them to Tarek, who was with us on that, of course, led one of our delegation, and Will was also a member, so he can pass them around to show you what the Tamimi family, at least the first 3, mother, father, and Ahed look like. This is important, and I want to kind of speak to this because we have no choice, just like the Tamimi family has no choice. I talked to the father and I said, you know, how do you let your children go out there? Your house is scheduled for demolition, and here they are protesting in front of the wall. Your son has been shot in the leg. Your brother-in-law has been killed with a shot from a sniper in his head. Why do you take these risks? And he said, we have no alternative. The alternative is to acquiesce. We will never acquiesce. And that's up to us as well. We can't acquiesce. I'm going to start with a little poem from Rudyard Kipling. And you'll see its significance, I hope, as I go on. It is not wise for the Christian white to hustle the Asian brown. For the Christian riles and the Asian smiles, and he weareth the Christian down. At the end of the fight is a tombstone white with the name of the late deceased, and the epitaph drear, a fool lies here who tried to hustle the East. That has to do with white supremacy, of which racism is a major, but not the only part. And I'd like to focus on that in my remarks here, since everything else about NATO has been so well covered. What's distinctive about NATO in this context? Anybody think about it? Yeah, all Europeans, and what else? All, yeah, right, all white. Right? All white, okay? Now, this is a long tradition. U.S.-led foreign policy. George Kennan, who used to be my favorite statesman, I found out he's elitist. I found out he's racist. And the first policy paper coming out of the State Department after the war said, we have control of the 50% of the world's resources, but only represent one ninth of the world's population. And so we have to take advantage of everybody else. No more talk about human rights. It's going to come to the exercise of hard power. That's what he said, okay? Now, Trump, what did he say? Well, when he was in China, he said, you know, I don't have anything against the Chinese. They take advantage of other countries. I admire that. You got to take advantage of other countries. He said that, okay? So this has to do with taking advantage. has to do with taking advantage of people in S-hole countries, right? And this is the archetypical white supremacist, Trump, white supremacist, white racist. It's us and they. Whether we call them slopes or gooks, sand camels or sand jockeys or whatever, towel heads, we make them the other. And all you need to do is watch Collateral Murder, which future Senator from Maryland, Chelsea Manning, released, and which WikiLeaks published, to realize what it does to our own troops. I mean, talk about brutalizing others, what our own troops are brutalized by this terrible, terrible white dominance or white supremacy. Now, last question, what's distinctive about our use of atomic weapons? Who do we use them on? Yeah, non-whites, people who Truman hated. Truman was a racist from the word go. He never referred to African Americans by any other label but the N-word. He had his Secretary of State, Jimmy Burns, from South Carolina, okay? And Jimmy Burns and Truman were the only people in our government that thought it was okay to use the atomic bomb on people. Why? Because those people didn't look like us. That's why. Those people could be marginalized. Those people could be easily made the other. The Germans, they kind of look like us, don't they? Most of them, right? And you put them in internment camps. You marginalize them. That's racism, folks. That's white supremacy. And from the great state of North Carolina comes also General William Westmoreland, who said after the war, you know, the Asians, they don't really have the same, they don't place the same value on life. Life is cheap. Life is cheap in the Orient. It's on film, folks. Now, of course, we have Lindsey Graham. Now, Lindsey Graham, he's saying now, I don't know, Armed Services Committee, they never told me there was troops in, I have to be careful about how I pronounce this now, Niger, yeah. They don't tell me people in, where's Niger? Oh, that's one of those asshole countries there. Oh, okay, okay. That's what we have, folks. So we have to face into it, all right? And we've been reminded here. We ought to take counsel and example from our African-American brothers and sisters. I want to share with you a letter that James Baldwin wrote back in November of 1970. It was given me as a birthday present yesterday for Nick Muttern's birthday. See, he doesn't take presents, but he gives them on his birthday. An open letter to my sister, Miss Angela Davis. She was in prison. November 19, 1970. Dear sister, one might have hoped that by this hour, the very sight of chains on black flesh would be so intolerable a sight for the American people, so unbearable a memory, that they would spontaneously rise up and strike off the manacles. But now, more than ever, Americans appear to measure their safety in the chains and the corpses of others. And so, Newsweek can put you on its cover, chained. You look exceedingly alone, say, as the Jewish housewife in the boxcar headed for Dachau, or as one of our ancestors chained together with others during the ocean passage. Well, since we live in an age in which silence is not only criminal, but suicidal, I have been making as much noise as I can here in Europe, on radio and TV. In fact, I have just returned from a land called Germany, which was made notorious by a silent majority not so very long ago. Listen to this part. Let me put it this way. As long as white Americans take refuge in their whiteness, they will allow millions of other people to be slaughtered. I'll say it again. As long as Americans take refuge in their whiteness, they will allow millions of other people to be slaughtered. So long as their whiteness puts so sinister a distance between their own experience and the experience of others, they will never feel themselves sufficiently worthwhile to become responsible for themselves. As we once put it in our black church, they will perish in their sins, that is, in their delusions. Now, we do feel sufficiently worthwhile to change our fate and the fate of our children, says James Baldwin. We know that a person is not a thing and is not to be placed at the mercy of other things. We know that air and water, this is 1970, folks. We know that air and water belong to all mankind and not merely to the wealthy. We know that a baby does not come into the world merely to be the instrument of someone else's profit. My dear sister Angela, some of us, white and black, know how great a price has already been paid to bring this new consciousness. If we know that, then we must fight for your life as though it were our own, which it is. We must render impassable with our own bodies the corridor to the gas chamber. For if they take you in the morning, they will take us in the night. Therefore, peace, Brother James. So the question is, do we feel sufficiently worthwhile? All of us. Then we ought to draw from the courage and the example of African American brothers and sisters. And one, we have to cut open the boil of ignorance. Now, Dr. King had, in his famous speech, in his famous letter from the Birmingham City Jail, he had a passage that is very seldom quoted, but one of my favorites. It's about a boil, right? Okay. Like a boil that can never be cured until it is opened with all its plus-flowing ugliness to the natural remedies of air and light, so too injustice must be uncovered with all the friction its uncovering creates. So the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured. So that's our first task. Is it impossible? Nothing is impossible for us. We got to do it. It can't be impossible by definition. We have to educate our brothers and sisters throughout this great land as to what's really going on. Okay, now secondly, we have to realize that there is such a thing as too late. Martin said that as well, didn't he? Okay, now, it's getting close, folks. It's getting real close. And I know some episodes from history where people waited until too late, okay? Now, some of you know about Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Germany, right? Well, there was another fellow in Germany about the same time. His name was Haushofer, was his name. Albrecht Haushofer. He was a geolog. He was a geologist at the University of Berlin. And some of you know what tenure means. He had tenure, okay? And how did he get tenure? By keeping his mouth shut. That's how he got tenure, right? Okay. And then as he watched his Jewish and other brothers and sisters being wrapped up, he had a conscience. And he started speaking out, and he created quite a following, okay? And he became a danger. So he is wrapped up and put in prison, just like Haushofer, different prison in Berlin. Now, the Nazis, of course, were very methodical. Before they'd kill you, and they'd either hang you or shoot you in those days, you had to confess. You had to have a confession. You had to write out your confession. And so Haushofer said, that's for the birds. I'm not going to do that. And as the Allies approached, they shot him, okay? Now, as he got up off the floor, as they picked him up off the floor, out of his pocket fell a little settle, a little piece of paper. It was his confession. It was written in the form of a sonnet. It's in German, but it's very brief. I'll read it to you. Doch. The name of it was schuldig. Schuld. Schuld. Anyone? Guilt. Doch bin ich schuldig, aber anders als ihr denkt. Yeah, I'm guilty, but it's not what you're thinking. Ich musste früher meine Pflicht erkennen. Ich musste schärfer Unheil nennen. I should have more quickly recognized my duty to call evil, evil. Mein Urteil habe ich zu lang gelenkt. My judgment I put off far too long. Ich habe gewarnt, he did warn, okay? He warned. Ich habe gewarnt, aber nicht genug. Und what's genug? No, right? Ich habe gewarnt, aber nicht genug und klar. Claro. There's no comparative in German for klar, right? Ich habe gewarnt, aber nicht genug und klar und heute weiß ich, was ich schuldig war. And today, I recognize what I was guilty of. So, folks, a lot of us that have enjoyed white supremacy, white privilege, I know I'm preaching sort of to the choir, but, we still haven't done enough for our own consciousness and to spread the word to our fellow citizens. There is an example here. It's the example of the Black Church. It's the example of the Civil Rights Movement. It's the example of the people who have spoken so eloquently here yesterday and the day before. So, last thing I'll say is this, that I noticed that some of you have the same color hair that I do. And there's a lesson there, because when I got beat up pretty bad by simply turning my back and standing up in front of Hillary Clinton 7 years ago now, well, Leah was vice president of Veterans for Peace at the time, right? And as soon as she heard about it, and it was on the news, like very briefly, she told everybody else in Veterans for Peace. And that is why Hillary Clinton got 7,565,251 telephone calls and emails, all right? Now, what's the point there? Well, young people, with all due respect, they got it coming to them. When they demonstrate and they get beat up, well, they're young people. But old people? Americans care about old people, all right? They don't like old people getting beat up. So you old people have a distinct advantage, all right? You've got to put it into play before it's too late. Thank you very much.
Ready to take some questions, and Anya's going to be calling on you.
Okay, we have a lot of people here. Should we start with the women, probably?
Is this okay? Okay, Linda Thompson. Could I see a hand of everybody here who's read Naomi Klein's Shock Doctrine? Okay, very good. For those of you who haven't, read it, because each panel is dealing with a different sector of the world. Naomi puts it all together. She did it years ago, and I don't think she gets the credit for the encyclopedia study she did of the neoliberal shock doctrine that they are applying every single place around the world, and she describes what is going on, and then she follows up with No is not enough. If you haven't read that one, read that one. Because she says this, you know, resistance is a slogan of the movement now. Resistance is reacting. And we've got to stop reacting. We have to have strategy where we are on the offensive, not playing on their ball field. And that is what the spring action is about. We'll be discussing that later. But we have to turn the tables. We have to have confidence in ourselves. I hear a lot of people expressing fear about taking this major step. But we can't be afraid. We have the best minds in this room. We have learned so much. We have such wonderful leaders who over 40 years of neoliberalism have lost confidence in themselves. And I just want to say, believe in yourself, we can do it.
Good morning. My name is Asantua Nkrumah Toure, Black Alliance for Peace and Green Party of Philadelphia. Woo-woo! We in the house. Okay. First of all, thanks to the panel. Secondly, Baba McGovern. I wasn't expecting that from you this morning, but we're gonna talk later. That was good. To our comrade from Ireland, I was just wondering, the Irish Republican movement. What is their response to some of the things that you mentioned in your presentation? What are they doing? What are they writing about? A blog, a website, whatever. Thank you.
Go ahead, John.
Okay. I guess the Irish Republican movement as it existed 20, 30, 40 years ago has probably morphed into the Sinn Féin party now that have sort of adopted the ballot box approach, and they've been anti-imperialist while being pro-European, which is a difficult one to resolve. They haven't been in government in Ireland yet. They will be, I think, within 10 to 20 years. And, you know, it's the whole context of Brexit and the British exit from the European Union is one that's sort of getting our attention at the moment, and one which is exercising the Sinn Féin quite a bit in terms of that land border between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland. We're having difficulty resolving that. And we do, I mean, Sinn Féin and the remnants of the Republican movement, the ones that have sort of adopted the ballot box, are vehemently pro-Irish neutrality. So they do want us out of the military alliances. They do want to ensure that we're not supportive of the European military alliance or militarization or British militarization. So they do give us some hope, but we need to work with them, put it that way.
So that men don't feel discriminated against? Here's a gentleman.
Yeah, this one. Thank you, everyone, and good morning, everyone. Okay. I wrote my questions down, so I'll be quick. And it's for each of the panelists. And I'll start with Ray McGovern. You went last. Ray, in your presentation, you spoke of the underlying and pervasive nature of war and oppression, occupation and imperialism being white supremacy and racism. What do you think UNAC can be doing to support the Poor People's Campaign this year? Phil, thank you for your presentation. What are the next steps for the Odessa Solidarity Campaign? UNAC has brought a great diversity of different groups and people who speak to the different issues around the world. And what is the Odessa campaign going to be doing this year? Perhaps working with other groups like Friends of the Congo, the Okinawa Solidarity Campaign, the folks who've spoken about what's going on in the Pacific, South America, Middle East, and so forth. And John Lannon, is there any movement in Ireland to try and actually enshrine neutrality into the Constitution? Is there a dialogue going on, or even a consciousness about Ireland's neutrality, the troop movements and the rendition flights and so forth? Thank you.
Is this working okay? Yeah. Maliki, what I would say about the Poor People's Campaign is this, that this conference here, the last 3 days, has been a case study in how to work a coalition to make an effective campaign. And so I would just simply say that, yeah, UNAC, but everybody else needs to be involved in this, and it's got to be modeled on the kind of participatory planning that has gone into this conference. And again, my hat's off to the organizers.
John, did you?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, would you like to go next? Or? I'll answer. So, any movements to enshrine neutrality in the Constitution in Ireland? The short answer to that question is yes, there are. And Sinn Féin have been one of the parties who have been pushing this. A number of independent members of Parliament have been working on this as well. One of the encouraging signs was that out of our national Parliament of 155 or 60, I can't remember the exact number, 42 voted against our participation in that PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation. So that's positive. That's a good base to work from. The wording of what goes into the Constitution is something we need to look carefully at. I like what's in the Maltese Constitution, one of the countries I said that did not participate in PESCO, but the Irish context is different, and without going into the detail on it, I think we do need to look carefully at our wording so that we don't allow what happened in 2002 to happen again. Essentially what happened in 2002 was that the government pushed through a resolution to allow temporary use of Shannon Airport by the US military for the illegal invasions and occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq. That temporary usage has continued for the last 15, 16 years, and it looks like it's continuing until such time as we manage to stop it. So we're continuing to work on that, and I think it's something that the mainstream media don't give enough coverage to. That doesn't surprise us. That's standard practice at this stage. You know, what we're saying doesn't get coverage, and the same as what all of you are saying probably doesn't get coverage in the mainstream media here. So we have to keep working on that. And I have to say that my colleague Roger Cole, who's in the Peace and Neutrality Alliance, the chairman of that, is getting more traction in the national media, as are a couple of others. And that's positive as well. That's encouraging.
In terms of, is that good? In terms of, that's the first time I used it, that's why I asked. I remembered what you said before. In terms of the Odessa Solidarity Campaign, Anna and Alexander and I had a good long talk last night. After the massacre of May 2nd, 2014, the relatives of those who were murdered or injured in the fire formed an organization called the Council of Mothers of May 2. And that is the group that the Odessa Solidarity Campaign has essentially been acting as a support group. So whatever we do is raised with that organization, and they tell us if they think it's a good idea and to go on and so forth. And we did carry out an International Day of Solidarity with the people of Odessa on October, I think it was October 10th of last year. In April, I'm sorry. Yeah, it was actually on the day of the liberation of Odessa from fascist occupation during World War II. 19 cities in 13 countries across North America and Europe participated in that, including an organization called the Union of Ukrainians in Exile in Moscow. Today, the Council of Mothers and others still go to Kulikovo Square, the site of the massacre, every month. But the repression has been very severe. It's not only the physical attacks, but as Alexander explained, arrests and frame-ups, and it's become extremely difficult for the Council of Mothers to function openly. So we have a website, OdessaSolidarityCampaign.org, where we have the history, the story of the massacre, reports on the solidarity work that's been done, and we've met many groups around across Europe who have committees in solidarity with the people of Odessa, and we're in touch with them. Our plans at this point is to keep putting up information about developments in Ukraine, the U.S. Involvement, news from what is happening in Ukraine. Anna, with another comrade of ours, formed a new website called Ukraine After Maidan, and they monitor local news reports translated into English, and then we post those on the Odessa Solidarity website as well. So Ukraine After Maidan website, just Google it, and the Odessa Solidarity Campaign. In terms of other groups that we work with, when Ray McGovern and I, on the day of the Solidarity, we brought a letter addressed to the President Petro Poroshenko. It makes it sound like I know it, like Ukrainian or Russian, right? I've learned at least to pronounce the words. I took Greek in high school, and that's all I ever got with Greek. But we delivered a letter addressed to the President of Ukraine, to the Ukrainian Embassy in Washington, D.C., and Paul Pumphrey from the Friends of the Congo accompanied us. And that was a great act of solidarity that I really appreciated. And of course, you know, we spoke about this issue, and a representative of the Council of Mothers spoke in Jackson, Mississippi, at the 20th anniversary conference of the Southern Human Rights Organizers conference led by Jaribu Hill and Ajamo Baraka. And then we did a tour through the South, holding meetings and so on. We expect that we will host visits from people from Odessa and looking for places to hold public meetings, show the film. If you just Google House of Trade Unions, May 2, 2014, there were a lot of cell phones operating that day. So it's unfiltered, you know, eyewitness. You can see what happened. And I think it was the BBC initially reported that the people who were murdered may have set the fires in themselves by throwing Molotov cocktails out the window, and they bounced back off the window back into the rooms. They actually said this. And if you watch the videos, it's a mob scene. It's a mass lynching, and there's no question about that. So we're going to continue to do that support. It's under difficult circumstances, but the Odessa Solidarity Campaign is permanent. When we got back from Odessa, we had fallen in love with the people there, the whole city, the people that we work with. They are our comrades. We will not abandon them. And we will try our best to make sure that the world attention is still, to some extent, focused on what is happening in Odessa and Ukraine as a whole. Sorry for talking so long.
Okay, it's getting more and more. The woman close to the aisle on the fourth row.
Thank you very much. Nellie Bailey from Black Alliance for Peace. My question is for all of the panelists, but Ray McGovern in particular. I read the report, the Pentagon report of the U.S. National War College, or the National War College, that concluded that we were in a post-supremacy U.S. And in fact, they admitted that the empire was collapsing, and the recommendation obviously was more of the same: greater surveillance, more expansion, yada, yada, yada. So my question is, why do you think they issued that public report? Because generally they are, you know, they hide this very obvious fact. And number two, I'm asking this in the context of the worry on everyone's mind about the possibility of war when we see, as you have discussed here today, NATO is on the doorstep of Russia, when we see the pivot to Asia, which is really about the containment of China, when you read the shithole tweets of Donald Trump, being very cavalier about nuclear weapons, it is a cause of concern for everyone, and I don't think it's a great scare or fear-mongering to think that we are on the verge of something very, very dangerous for all in the political context. So why are we looking at these naval bases, and why are we holding these meetings? Because there's a larger context of these crazy neocons and the general administration.
Yeah, well, I would say that it's not an oversimplification to say that the military intelligence, the military industrial intelligence, media, deep state complex is at the core of all this. There are lots of people making lots of money. When Putin announced 2 years ago that he thought maybe he wasn't going to play our game, that he might even reduce the defense spending in Russia, there were gasps coming up from Raytheon and Lockheed. And then they announced there was a pivot to Asia, and there was a big celebration in those big Texas churches. Hallelujah! We got Asia now. We can build some more arms and stuff. That's what it's all about. So what we need to do, is kind of take forward action here. We know where the CEO of Westinghouse lives. He lives an hour outside of New York. And I was at a Columbia University event, and a bunch of students there, and this was mentioned in the context of and I fully expected, because I'm about 40 years behind the curve here, that there would be a big meeting right away in the back of the thing. So who's going to hire the bus to go out there to Morristown, New Jersey, and picket this guy's house? But instead of that, we got, oh, well, that's interesting. So what I'm saying here is that what we need to do is kind of shame these people into realizing that we're up to their game, okay? And we're not going to allow it to continue. And the worst thing, of course, and the last thing I'll say is that Obama, wishy-washy Obama, at least now and then he, resisted the pressure to attack Syria or to give lethal arms to Ukraine. Now this, anybody know if asshole is hyphenated? Okay, well, as an adjective, maybe. All right, so this adjective guy, okay, he's going to give lethal arms to Ukraine. Now, this is going to be a real problem, okay? It's going to be a real problem if they start using them in the east part of Ukraine, okay? Now, when Obama was thinking about doing it, Angela Merkel from Germany came to Washington. They talked, and they had a press conference after it. And it was quite remarkable. One of the correspondents said, President Obama, are you going to give weapons to Ukraine? And he said, well, that's under discussion. And Angela Merkel said, eine schlechte Idee. It's a lousy idea. And then he says, well, we'll get another question. And he goes, well, we're thinking about it. She says, noch eine schlechte Idee. Another really bad idea. So the Germans, the war, for God's sake, okay? They're not supposed to act like babies or even adolescents anymore. They need to take charge of their own affairs. It's going to take some more time. But if Angela Merkel gets a government together, what looks like she might now with the Social Democrats, then there's a chance. As Elsa has pointed out, the Social Democrats have adopted some reasonable policies with respect to drones and elsewhere. So So what I'm saying is that there's two strains here. There's the crazy at Washington and the Marine generals who salute smartly and just do what they're told. And then there's the allies who are beginning to fray. I mean, talked about Greece before. Well, Turkey is out of the alliance for all practical purposes. They're buying Russian weapons, for God's sake, which we never thought would happen. So there's a lot of hope, but there's a lot of danger, too. And you rightly point out the danger because this guy is unpredictable, and that's the worst. We heard, 30 minutes of alert in Hawaii? Well, we ain't got 30 minutes anymore, folks. And if I were Mr. Putin, I would have to tell you that I would have my rocket forces on full alert because there's no explaining what would happen if Trump did something stupid and the ramrod Marine general saluted and discharged his orders. So it's very dangerous. It's dangerous to Ukraine from a conventional point of view, at least initially, and it's dangerous from a strategic point of view because there have been several instances in the past where only a human person intervened between destroying the world. I mean, it sounds crazy, doesn't it? But that's what we're talking about. And thanks for asking that question.
We have only time for one more question. And please, if you have had a chance to address the crowd already, don't raise your hand. We're going to ask one more question, and then we'll give each of the panelists a very brief time to sum up. Okay?
Please have two. We have one young person, and then Elsa has been having her hand for us since the beginning. Could we have two of these people, young person there and Elsa?
You know, folks, you know what? If you had showed up on time when we started the conference, we would have a whole lot more time for the questions, okay?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andres, and I'm a... Hello?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's good.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andres, and I'm affiliated with...
Can't hear you.
My name is Andres, and I'm affiliated with the PSUV, Partido Socialista Unido Venezolano, or the Socialist Party in Venezuela. Mm-hmm.
I didn't hear that.
Well, I was noticing how there's a bit of a lack of younger people here, or rather, myself, sadly, or people who were young during the war, any of them. But I had wanted to ask, in Venezuela, there is much of an access to free media, but with the U.S. putting almost a bit of an embargo when it comes to coverage of issues that take precedence in the world, what can we do to educate young people, especially with issues such as Ireland or Donbass, as to what is actually going on and not what American media is trying to tell you?
Well, obviously, we have to do.
You know what? Let's answer that in your summary. And I'm going to, Elsa, you've got 1 minute. 1 minute, Elsa.
I just wanted to underscore what Ray said about the racism, the importance of this. I think it should be a core issue in whatever campaign we make. It's more important than how much the bases are costing us. It's also even more important, shall we say, than the environment, how it's harming people of Germany. It's how many people are we killing and why. And I want to give one little detail about Germany and NATO and EU, just to clarify something that I just want to say, incidentally, that 1 million East Germans wrote postcards to Angela Davis, just as a little detail of support. Yeah. And the Germans have worked long on themselves, and they want to avoid the war on terror approach. But they are being dragged with racism into this approach. They have said no inside NATO. A lot of people don't know. NATO, they have veto power. Afghanistan was a NATO war, but Iraq was not, and others, most of them have not been. And it's been from vetoes within. But in the European Union, Germany is going down the slippery slope now, entered Syria because in an EU partnership with France after what happened in Paris. And also, France is also going to get weaponized from Mali, okay? And Germany's in Mali with France. Now, are they going to buckle on their principles that were across Europe, over 500 against murdering, targeted killing? Or are they going to buckle on this now in the EU partnership?
Yes, it is about white supremacy, and yes, it is about people. Thank you.
All right, panelists, if you please.
Yeah, well, let me just say briefly that Americans don't know a lot, and that's partly their fault. Well, it's the media. But, some of them have two jobs. They come home, they're tired, they feed the kids, they put their feet up, and then they think they're getting some news from Fox News, So you got to be understanding about this. But what they don't, what we need to do is, I think, approach the media as the most important issue, initially at least. You have to educate people. And you have to realize that when Ukraine became front and center, there was a good segment of American people that thought Ukraine was an island in the Pacific. I kid you not, okay? So my suggestion is you do something really simple, like show that map that shows how terrible, how aggressive the Russians are to put their country right in the middle of all our bases. Show them that map. That map speaks for itself. Thank you.
On the question of youth, youth are in motion. They're in Black Lives Matter. They're in the LGBTQ movement, the environmental movement, the undocumented movement. They are not sitting passively somewhere outside waiting for us to motivate them to get involved. They are in motion, and we are not many organizations are not involved in those issues, that instead concentrating primarily on international issues. Our organization, we have 12 members, and 4 in the issues, anti-war issues. We met them through other struggles, and we have and they're at an anti-war conference. I think what we do is have to stop thinking, how can we go out and bring young people into our movement? We have to go out and meet people where they are and support their struggles.
Okay, I think I'll just say I agree with Phil and with Ray. And some of the phrases they used are the ones we need to keep in mind. Keep making noise. And nothing is impossible. That's another one that I keep hanging on to as well. These EU partner with US and NATO strengthening alliances, and we need to do the same as well. We always need to strengthen our alliances. Keep that phrase, cooperate in times of war in mind. We need to cooperate as well. We need to work together, halt the expansionism, the militarism. And we need to curb the military spending. By the way, we kicked Raytheon out of Ireland. I don't know if you knew that. The Jerry Anti-War Coalition did that a couple of years back, and that was a great little coup for us to be able to say that. And that corporatization of war that I mentioned, it's all around us, and we need to expose that as well. 2 very simple examples of it. The Ramstein Air Base is sucking the life out of the region around it, as Elsa and others know. The university that I'm working in is got projects that are, basically working towards militarization as well, cooperating with partners from places like Israel on those projects as well. And we need to expose that. That's happening through things called Horizon 2020, which is the big European fund for research. And as Europeans, we need to work on stopping the NATO expansion east and the interference in countries like Ukraine. We need to stop the empire building and most certainly exposing the grand lies that are presented to us by the mainstream media. That's really important. And the last point I'd make is the importance of working with our friends in places like Ukraine and elsewhere. And you know, let's be led by the people sort of that our empires are othering, coming back to what Ray was saying. You know, and make sure we never fall into the same trap of thinking we have all the answers. And one fine example of that I'll finish up with is supporting campaigns like the BDS, the Boycotts, Divestments and Sanctions, that was initiated by Palestinian civil society. You know, we need to keep supporting those campaigns, and we need to keep preaching to the people that are not yet converted.
Thank you, panel.